Welcome back. Today we are diving into a really fascinating and maybe a little mind-bending idea. It's a framework that could totally flip our understanding of reality and, well, our own minds.
So let me ask you a question. What do you think is the single biggest, most profound mystery left in science? I mean, think about it. We have mapped the entire human genome. We've literally detected ripples in space-time from black holes crashing into each other billions of light years away. We've done some incredible stuff. But what's the one thing that's still just completely baffling?
Well, it turns out the greatest mystery might not be out there in the depths of space. It's actually right here, inside your own head. It's the very thing that's allowing you to experience this right now. The colors, the sounds, the thoughts. It's consciousness itself.
All right, so to really get why the framework we're talking about today is so cool, you first have to understand the problem it's trying to solve. And it's a big one, a puzzle that has kept scientists and philosophers up at night for centuries. It's called the hard problem. So, what is the hard problem? Well, it's pretty simple to ask, but almost impossible to answer. We can figure out the easy parts, how neurons fire and process information. But the hard part is, why does any of that feel like anything? How do a bunch of electrical signals in a squishy brain create the rich inner experience of your life? The actual feeling of seeing the color red or the taste of your morning coffee?
So, historically, this debate has been a total stalemate. On one side, you've got the materialists. They say, look, you get enough complex matter, like a brain, and eventually, poof, consciousness just kind of turns on. But they have no idea how that poof happens. Then on the other side, you have the idealists who say consciousness is the fundamental stuff of the universe, which is interesting, but it doesn't really answer the question. It just sort of sidesteps it. We're stuck. And this is where things get really interesting. The source material for this explainer proposes something radical. It says, what if this whole deadlock, this entire hard problem, only exists because we're starting with a totally flawed assumption? What if we're asking the wrong question from the very beginning?
So let's get into it. This is the heart of the fractal framework. It offers up this really elegant analogy to help us reframe the whole conversation. And it starts with something we all learned about in school: gravity. Okay, think about this for a second, because it's so simple, but it's really profound. We would never look at a planet and ask, how did that giant rock invent the concept of weight, right? That question just sounds silly to us. We know that's not how it works. A planet doesn't emit weight. Instead, we know weight is what happens when an object with mass interacts with a fundamental property of the universe: gravity. Gravity is just a part of the fabric of the cosmos. It's there. Mass bumps up against it, and the result is what we call weight. Now, here's the leap. The framework says, let's apply that exact same logic to consciousness. What if the brain doesn't create consciousness any more than a planet creates weight? What if consciousness, like gravity, is just a fundamental property of the universe, and our subjective experience, that feeling of redness, what philosophers call qualia, is simply what happens when our own little pocket of awareness interacts with this universal field? So let's just break that down. The brain isn't a generator. It's more like a receiver or an interface. It tunes into a pre-existing universal field of consciousness. And that interaction is what creates our individual nested awareness. And just like that, the hard problem just dissolves. You're not asking how matter magically creates mind anymore. You're just saying that awareness, by its very nature, feels like something when it's filtered through a complex system like a brain. It's a fundamental rule of the game, not some magic trick. Now, it's super important to understand this next part. The authors of this framework are really clear about one thing. This isn't a new religion. It's not supposed to be the final absolute truth. Its real power is in how useful it is as a tool for thinking. They put it perfectly here. The framework is a map, not the territory. It's a guide to help us explore, not a final destination that tells us we know everything. The best way to think of it is as a meta-lens. It's a new way of looking at the problem that doesn't necessarily throw out old ideas, but puts them into a bigger, more interesting context. Yeah, see, its goal is to bring ideas together, not to fight with them. It looks at all these other big theories of consciousness, like IIT or global workspace theory, and it doesn't see them as competitors. It sees them as totally valid descriptions of different pieces of the same giant cosmic puzzle. Each theory is just looking at a different facet of the same diamond.
But here's the thing. This isn't just a nice bit of philosophy. The framework has a really bold ambition, which is to go from this powerful metaphor all the way to a serious, testable scientific model built on math.
And the path it lays out basically mirrors the history of physics. The first step? Just like Newton gave us a law for gravity, the idea is we could develop a qualia attraction law to maybe predict how intense an experience is. But then it gets even wilder. The next step is to do what Einstein did, to develop consciousness field equations that would describe qualia not as some force, but as the actual geometry of experience itself. Pretty mind-blowing stuff.
What's really cool about this framework is how upfront it is about not being finished. It totally admits there are gaps, but it doesn't see these gaps as failures. It sees them as open invitations for smart people to come and help build it. And the big questions are put right out there on the table. Like, what's the actual mechanism? How does this universal field talk to a local brain? How do we design an experiment that could prove this model right and other models wrong? How do you even measure awareness capacity? And what does this all mean for evolution? These are the next frontiers, the big challenges waiting to be solved.
And that really gets to the core spirit of this whole thing. It's not about one side winning an argument. It's about bringing two types of thinkers together. The dreamer philosopher who can imagine these big new ideas, and the hard-nosed materialist scientist who can build the tools to actually test them. I love this quote from the source material. It really captures the whole vibe. Instead of seeing two ideas as opposites that can't both be true, it asks, well, what if they're both right, just from different angles? Finding that sweet spot where they overlap, that, it suggests, is like a cheat code for finding truth.
So we'll leave it with this final question to chew on. If this is right, if consciousness is a fundamental field that permeates the universe, what does it even mean to explore it? It kind of suggests that a scientist in a lab, a philosopher thinking in their study, and you just quietly observing your own thoughts, we're all just exploring different aspects of the very same fundamental reality. And that is a pretty amazing thought to end on.